Imagine boarding a first-class flight, carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, only to be mistaken for someone whose role is service, not leadership. Dr. Nadine Carter, a brilliant CEO and architect of global ethics in aviation, faces this exact moment of quiet injustice. But what happens when a single question whispered across the aisle, "Are you the nanny?" sparks a revolution in how dignity is seen and demanded at 35,000 feet? This is not just a story about one flight or one woman's strength. It's a powerful journey into the unspoken biases that still shape our world, even in places designed for comfort and privilege. How does silence become a weapon? How does quiet resilience force an entire industry to reckon with its blind spots? And what price is paid when respect is withheld simply because of who someone is? As we follow Nadine's calm yet unyielding path from the cabin to corporate boardrooms and beyond, prepare to confront your own assumptions. This story asks who decides who belongs, and how far will one person's stillness move the world? If you're ready to challenge what you think you know about power, respect, and justice, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. The boarding lane for Flight 815 to New York moved slowly, with the kind of unspoken choreography only seasoned travelers understood. Phones out, IDs ready, eyes half focused, half distracted. It was the kind of line where no one really looked at one another until she stepped forward. Dr. Nadine Carter didn't rush. She moved with a pace that didn't need permission. Tailored navy coat, soft leather heels, a scarf the color of deep autumn, knotted precisely. In her left hand, a slim carry-on. In her right, the small, eager hand of her grandson, Micah. He was 9, wearing a Jurassic Park hoodie, sneakers that blinked green at the heel, and holding a battered sketchbook, the kind with drawings halfway through every page and pencil smudges along the edges. They made a quiet pair, one refined, one wild-hearted, but they moved like one unit. The agent at the gate barely glanced up. Boarding Group 1. Welcome aboard. They stepped into the jet bridge. Nadine didn't speak, but she glanced once toward Micah's face. He was biting his lip, trying not to show his excitement. His first time in business class, not just first time in the premium seat, his first time traveling as her guest. Nadine Carter was flying back from Lisbon. She had just given the closing address at the Global Infrastructure and Ethics Forum. Her talk on dignity frameworks in privatized public systems. She didn't just speak. She co-authored the entire ethics charter the industry was adopting. But she wasn't here as a keynote speaker anymore. Now, she was simply Nana. The jet bridge ended, and the flight attendant smiled. Welcome aboard. Nadine returned the smile, polite but not overdrawn. She adjusted her scarf and guided Micah gently toward seat 2A. It was a wide, window-side seat, already set with a folded blanket, a glass of citrus water, and the soft hum of ambient jazz from the speakers above. She placed her bag into the overhead bin, helped Micah climb into the seat beside hers, and then it happened. From across the aisle, a voice, polished, warm, too practiced to be casual. "Excuse me, is the child's mother joining us later?" Nadine paused. She hadn't even sat down yet. Micah was pulling out his colored pencils. The question hadn't registered for him. Not yet. But Nadine turned, slowly, her face still composed. The woman in seat 2B was in her mid-60s, blouse neatly pressed, pearl earrings, book in one hand, a copy of the Financial Ledger. Eyes kind but sharp, like someone who'd been running boardrooms before anyone called it lean-in culture. Nadine gave no answer. The woman smiled again. "I just meant it's lovely that you're helping him travel." "So kind. I'm sure the parents appreciate you making the effort." She tilted her head, waiting for confirmation. Still no response. The silence pressed in like altitude. Nadine looked down slowly, adjusted Micah's seatbelt, smoothed his hoodie. Then she sat, crossed her legs, and opened the in-flight magazine. She didn't even glance back. But inside her chest, something flickered. Not anger, not even hurt, just a decision. Micah leaned toward her. "Nana, can I use the tray table for my coloring?" "Of course, baby," she whispered. The woman across the aisle kept reading, unaware. A few rows back, a younger man in a tech startup hoodie was watching. His gaze lingered, then turned back to his tablet, but his brow furrowed. Nadine reached into her blazer and tapped the small pin on her lapel. It looked decorative, a matte silver emblem barely noticeable. But it wasn't jewelry. It was a biometric key. She pressed it twice. A soft chime activated in her ear. A voice responded within seconds. "Dr. Carter, this is Naomi Reyes. Channel secure. Flag Halcyon Airlines Flight 815. Nadine said softly, "Under which protocol?" Reyes asked, tone calm but alert. Nadine's reply was quieter still. "Clause 7B, passenger dignity risk, effective immediately." There was a pause. "Understood," said Reyes, initiating real-time integrity review. The line went silent. Micah looked up again. Curious. Nadine smiled at him, just faintly. And in that moment, a data packet left the secure ethics server in Geneva and made its way across 4 continents, 8 aviation partnerships, and the compliance servers of Halcyon Airlines. It was discreet, but not invisible. At 7:22 p.m., the internal system at Halcyon headquarters in Chicago pinged red. Subject real-time ethics violation alert source GIEC chair, Carter. The passenger integrity index had just flagged the flight. Clause 7B had not been activated in over a year. But when it was, the message was clear. Your system failed quietly. Now the consequences will arrive loudly. Nadine didn't speak for the rest of boarding. She let the moment settle. Micah resumed coloring. She glanced out the window once. Lisbon's fading coastline was still visible, golden in the last light. The hum of the cabin resumed its rhythm. But something had already changed. And somewhere beneath the surface of this otherwise polite flight, the machine had started turning. Not because she shouted, not because she demanded, because she knew the rules she had written them. And now, she would simply watch as they did their job. 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed. Soft music played overhead, something instrumental, meant to soothe. Dinner service hadn't started yet, but you could feel the atmosphere shifting from busy to still. Dr. Nadine Carter sat perfectly straight, hands folded, eyes on the window. But she wasn't really looking outside. Micah had already fallen asleep beside her. One hand curled into his sketchbook, the other tucked beneath the blanket. His headphones had slipped sideways over one ear, and every few minutes, he mumbled something about dinosaurs. She smiled, not outwardly, just enough for herself. Then she exhaled, long and slow. She had learned a long time ago that stillness was a form of armor. But on airplanes, it could feel like a cage. There was something about being buckled in, suspended in air, trapped between countries, between versions of yourself, especially when the weight of 2 worlds sat quietly on your lap. The woman across the aisle hadn't spoken again, but Nadine could feel the glance, the flicker of embarrassment, maybe confusion, maybe neither. It didn't matter. She had already seen the kind of woman Rebecca Langston was. Well-meaning, well-educated, well-insulated, The kind that wrote checks to schools like the one Micah attended, but still clutched her bag when walking past his mother on the street. Nadine reached for her water, took a sip. She thought about replying back then, about saying, "No, I'm not the nanny. I'm his grandmother. I'm also the chair of the Global Infrastructure and Ethics Council. And the reason your airline hasn't been dropped from 6 international funding programs is because I argued they deserved time to fix themselves. But what would that have done? It would have been about ego, about needing her to understand. And Nadine wasn't here to be understood. She was here to watch her grandson fall asleep next to clouds, to witness his wonder. That was the assignment today. Still, the moment stirred something older, something she had folded and packed away a long time ago. She thought about the last time someone asked her if she was with the child. That had been in a hospital lobby in Boston. She was in her 2nd year of surgical residency. Her coat still had blood on the cuff from a code blue she had helped stabilize, and a volunteer at the front desk asked her to wait with the other parents until the real doctor arrives. That was 2 decades ago. The volunteer never apologized, but the attending surgeon did. A few hours later, quietly, almost whispering, "It's just that you don't look like what they expect." That line had followed her for years, and yet she had kept moving. Degrees from Princeton, then Johns Hopkins, multiple board positions, co-founder of a nonprofit that helped rebuild health systems in post-conflict nations, 4-time keynote at the Global Human Equity Summit, and most recently, author of the Carter Standards, a comprehensive ethics compliance framework now adopted by 7 G7 nations. Still she was with the child. Her eyes drifted down to Micah again. She hadn't planned on raising him, but when her daughter passed 3 years ago a sudden illness, a cascade of medical mistakes no one could explain, she stepped in. No hesitation, no grand announcement, just a quiet decision that no one else was going to raise this boy but her. He reminded her so much of his mother, his curiosity, his way of drawing worlds no one else could see, his stubbornness. There were days she woke up unsure if she was doing enough for him, if she was giving him joy alongside the responsibility, if he laughed enough, if she had become too much like a fortress and not enough like a home. She had spent so much of her life building systems. But Micah was the one thing she couldn't systematize. He had to be loved in real time. And that, more than any summit or speech, was the work that terrified her most. She leaned back against the headrest, closed her eyes. She remembered Lisbon. Just 2 days ago, she had stood on stage in front of an audience of global leaders, aviation regulators, infrastructure CEOs. The applause after her closing remarks had been long and deliberate. The topic, the invisible variable dignity as a non-negotiable metric. They called her brilliant, brave, visionary. They stood for her. And now, just 48 hours later, someone mistook her for the help. The whiplash didn't hurt anymore, but it still whispered. Sometimes she wondered what it would feel like to walk through a space and be seen completely. Not for her degrees, not for her eloquence, just seen, noted, acknowledged. Even now, she knew that the systems she helped change often gave the credit to others. She watched as boardrooms praised CEOs for implementing bold reforms they had to be legally pressured into adopting. She read editorials that quoted her standards without ever citing her name, and she had learned to accept that quiet influence often comes without applause, but not without weight. Her phone buzzed once, just a soft pulse. She opened the secure feed on her tablet. Naomi's message had arrived. Clause 7B escalation has triggered preliminary freezes at Dublin, Abu Dhabi and O'Hare, ESG Partners, Green Crescent, and Valtrex Equity now requesting full compliance review. Do you wish to proceed with a Tier 2 engagement? Nadine didn't reply yet. She looked back at Micah. The lighting above his seat was casting a gentle gold across his forehead. His curls were wild against the blanket. His mouth opened just slightly in sleep. She reached out and brushed a crumb from his cheek. Then she typed a short reply. Hold Tier 2. Begin audit shadow. Passive for now. The system would listen. She didn't need noise. She needed clarity. Across the aisle. Rebecca shifted in her seat. She seemed to be trying to decide whether to speak again, whether to apologize, but she didn't. And Nadine didn't offer an opening. She wasn't here to teach anyone. That wasn't her calling anymore. The teaching would come through protocol, through consequence, through the simple, inescapable truth that actions, even polite ones, have echoes. Nadine reached into her bag and pulled out an old envelope, worn at the edges, addressed in her late daughter's handwriting. She kept it with her always. Hadn't opened it in years, but tonight she did. Inside was a letter written just before Micah was born. Mom, if you're reading this, I'm probably too tired or too scared to say this out loud, but I just wanted you to know if anything ever happens to me, you're who I want him to remember. Not for your power, but for your patience. Nadine folded the letter slowly. She hadn't cried in years, but something in her chest broke quietly. It didn't come with noise, just warmth and weight. She pressed her hand to her heart, exhaled, then leaned back into the quiet. Outside, the Atlantic stretched beneath them. The seatbelt light blinked off. But somewhere between Lisbon and New York, a legacy was traveling quietly at 35,000 feet. Not in her title, not in her speech, but in the boy beside her and the system now watching. Because she was done explaining. Now, she would simply hold the pen and let others read what she wrote. Some moments don't arrive with drama. They arrive with stillness, and sometimes stillness is sharper than sound. It was 2 hours into the flight when the temperature inside the cabin shifted. Not the air, not the lighting, but something subtler, something you couldn't name unless you were paying attention. Nadine Carter was always paying attention. She felt it the moment the young flight attendant re-entered the cabin. Her name tag read Eva. Early 20s. Bright eyes. Her walk had that mix of formality and nerves that came from training videos and recent certifications. She was new. Eva had entered the cabin with a tray of drinks, but something about her posture was off. Not wrong. Just pulled tight. She kept her head down, eyes scanning her notes, double-checking which passenger had requested the sparkling water with lemon, which had asked for club soda. But when she reached Nadine's row, she hesitated. Slight. Barely a pause. But it was there. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the drink on Nadine's tray. Then, very softly, almost inaudibly, she said, "Ma'am, I saw your session in Lisbon." Nadine turned her head slowly, not sharply, just enough. Eva flushed. "The ethics keynote. They played a clip in our onboarding last week." "You were amazing." Nadine offered a nod. "Thank you." The girl smiled. "Too fast. Too wide. I just sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt." Then she turned and moved on. But her pace had changed. Faster now. More deliberate. Like someone realizing too late they'd misunderstood the room. Across the aisle, Rebecca Langston shifted uncomfortably. Her hands were folded neatly over her lap. Her book hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. The pearl bracelet on her wrist clinked lightly as she adjusted her posture. She hadn't looked at Nadine since boarding, but now she glanced, quick, like a reflex. Nadine didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew the look. She had seen it for decades. The post-assumption realization. That moment when someone realized they had misread the power in the room, when what they thought was a story about class and caretaking suddenly became about credentials and consequence. It wasn't guilt in the glance. It was something deeper. Disruption. Because Rebecca hadn't just misjudged who Nadine was. She had misjudged what Nadine was. And now she sat with the weight of that realization. Micah stirred in his sleep. He mumbled something about raptors and turned on his side, still wrapped in his blanket. Nadine reached over and adjusted his pillow. Then she returned to stillness. It wasn't passive. It was strategy. She didn't need to correct people out loud anymore. Her presence had already issued a correction. Back in Halcyon Airlines headquarters in Chicago, the escalation alerts had reached the desk of Chief Compliance Officer Jonas Merrill. He was in the middle of a late call when the alert pinged on his screen. He leaned forward, read the notification twice, then swore under his breath. "Tell me this isn't who I think it is," he muttered. His assistant, a young woman named Lila, blinked. Clause 7B was activated by GIEC Chair Carter. Jonas leaned back in his chair. "You have got to be kidding me." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I thought she was flying private this year." Apparently not. He turned toward his second monitor, pulled up the airline's equity dashboard, watched as the ESG fund markers began to fluctuate. Green crescent yellow, Valtrex blinking orange. Halcyon Airlines had just entered compliance watch. He stood abruptly. Get legal, get PR, and for God's sake, get operations. Now! Meanwhile, inside the aircraft cabin, the second flight attendant, older, more experienced, approached Nadine. "Dr. Carter," he said quietly. She looked up, calm. "My apologies." "I didn't realize," Nadine held up her hand gently. "No need," she said. "We're already in the air. Let's keep it civil." The attendant nodded, then stepped back. Rebecca heard it. He had said her name. Dr. Carter. Not ma'am. Not miss. Not guest. Doctor. She closed her book. The shame came not in waves, but in pinpricks. Tiny flashbacks she couldn't stop. The way she had spoken earlier. The tone. The assumption. It hadn't been malicious, but it had been. Revealing. And now, that mirror wouldn't stop staring back at her. Her whole life, Rebecca had considered herself enlightened. Donor to public libraries, host to community dinners. She read The Atlantic, voted for every civil rights bill she could remember. But here, in this seat, her instincts had spoken first. And what they said, it wasn't flattering. She swallowed hard. She wanted to say something, anything. But the words felt small now. Thin. What do you say to someone you've misjudged that badly? Do you explain? Do you apologize? Or do you accept that the damage isn't yours to define? Nadine didn't make it easier for her. She didn't smile, didn't offer an exit ramp. She just sat with quiet, elegant authority, like someone who had grown used to being underestimated, then quietly redefined the room. And maybe that was the worst part for Rebecca, the part she couldn't stop turning over in her mind. It wasn't that Nadine was angry. It was that she wasn't. She didn't need Rebecca to be wrong out loud. She already had systems that would speak for her. At that moment, the first announcement came over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning dinner service shortly. Please remain seated and keep your tray tables closed for now." The voice was steady, professional, But inside Halcyon's operational center, nothing was steady. By now, 7 international airports had received soft alerts, not public, not formal, but enough. Lisbon, Dublin, Abu Dhabi, O'Hare, Incheon, Toronto, JFK. They had been notified of a pending compliance downgrade. At JFK's Executive Operations Terminal, a quiet meeting was already being scheduled. Subject Halcyon Flight 815, Carter Protocol triggered, immediate review. The news hadn't gone public, but the wave had begun. On board. Nadine reached into her briefcase and pulled out a printed report. She had been reviewing infrastructure investment gaps across underserved urban transport systems, but the words blurred now. She wasn't tired. She was calculating. Would this be the time she escalated to a public audit? Would she let the protocol run its full course? Or would she let the internal mechanisms correct themselves quietly? She hadn't decided yet. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about visibility. About reminding the industry that dignity isn't optional at 35,000 feet. That visibility wasn't vanity. It was survival. She looked at Micah again, still sleeping, still whole, and that was the only victory she needed tonight. She reached down and gently pulled the blanket higher over his shoulder, then closed her eyes. The woman across the aisle didn't speak. The cabin lights dimmed once more, but above them, the sky remained clear, and below them, the world was quietly rearranging itself one assumption at a time. The hum of the engines became the background to something much louder, something unspoken. Power doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it slips in through silence. Dakar. Nadine Carter sat still, not passive, not withdrawn, but aware. She had made the call. Now the system would respond. At exactly 9:26 p.m. Eastern Time, a confidential ping echoed through the private server used by Halcyon Airlines Compliance Division. It was labeled Tier 1 Soft Escalation, Dignity Risk Protocol Code GIEC-7B. The receiving officer in Halcyon's New York branch didn't even finish reading the file before reaching for the phone. Get Merrill. Right now. In Washington. A junior policy advisor for the Department of Transportation forwarded the alert to her supervisor with one line. Carter's in motion, in Abu Dhabi. An ESG compliance manager paused mid-presentation when the system locked his dashboard for Halcyon Investments. In Dublin, an ethics officer stepped out of his daughter's birthday dinner to take a call he couldn't ignore. It took just 7 minutes for the entire airline's posture to shift. All because one woman had tapped a pin on her lapel. And said almost nothing. Back on the plane. Nadine sipped her water slowly. Micah stirred again beside her. She rubbed his shoulder gently until he settled. Across the aisle. Rebecca Langston hadn't moved in a while. She was staring down at her folded hands, occasionally glancing at the window, as though the clouds might offer an escape. She hadn't spoken a word since the truth of Nadine's identity had surfaced. But her silence was no longer comfortable. It was restless, fractured. She had underestimated her seatmate. That part she could swallow. But what gnawed at her now was something far more uncomfortable. She had categorized Nadine before even speaking to her. Not as a peer, not even as a person, but as a role, a service function. Someone placed in proximity to power, not in possession of it. And now, as the realization settled in like a chill through linen, she began to understand just how layered her assumption had been. The pearls, the cardigan, the smile, they hadn't protected her from bias. They had dressed it up. She clenched her hands, suddenly aware of how tightly she was holding her own discomfort. She wondered if she should apologize. But what would she say? I didn't know who you were. Would that make it better or worse? Would it only prove her mistake? Nadine didn't offer her an answer. She wasn't here to fix anything for anyone but the child sleeping beside her. And yet, her silence was doing more than any speech could. It was speaking in boardrooms, in conference calls, in shareholder inboxes, in the systems built to monitor the very assumption she had just endured. And she had built them. 4 years ago, Nadine Carter had proposed the Passenger Dignity Assurance Model PDM for short as a framework to measure non-physical, dignity-based compliance in the aviation industry. At the time, it had been dismissed as abstract. Some called it performative. Others said it was impossible to track. But she had pushed, backed it with data, paired it with machine learning to identify patterns in crew behavior and passenger treatment based on name, seat class, skin tone, and nationality fields. And then she did something more powerful than argue. She built partnerships. She linked the model to ESG scores, made it a prerequisite for green investment funds, tied it to insurance premiums and airport access in Europe and parts of Asia. Over time, the model wasn't just a recommendation, it became currency, and tonight, it was collecting. At Halcyon's Midtown Manhattan headquarters, CEO Jonas Merrill stood at the center of a glass-walled conference room with 6 executives around him. The screen behind him showed live analytics of PDM performance risk. Status, he barked. His legal chief responded first. We're in soft downgrade. No press leak yet. But Lisbon, Incheon, and Dublin have all escalated flags to Level 2 advisory. ESG exposure. The CFO answered this time. We're at a 9. 2 risk rating on Carter-triggered incidents. If this continues, we'll lose Green Crescent and Deltor Partners by morning. Jonas slammed his hand against the table. All this over, what a damn seat mix-up. His PR director cleared her throat. It's not about the seat. It's about the assumption, and about who we made it in front of. Jonas turned to her, nostrils flaring. You saying this is our fault, I'm saying? She exhaled. When Nadine Carter moves, she moves systems, and she doesn't play for the cameras. That makes her 10 times more dangerous. Jonas paced once, twice, then stopped. Draft an apology, not to her, to our stakeholders. Start with a commitment to audit all crew interactions flagged for dignity compliance. We need to get ahead of this. One of the advisors muttered under his breath. We should have recognized her at boarding. Jonas shook his head. That's not the point. The problem isn't that we didn't recognize her. It's that we didn't even imagine she could be who she was. Back on the flight. Nadine opened her tablet again. She wasn't reviewing the risk dashboard. She was reading a message from Naomi Reyes. Subject status update. Tier 2 audit has not been triggered. Holding pattern active. ESG blocks pending. No leaks detected. Would you like to proceed with Phase 2? Nadine looked down at Micah. His breathing had deepened. He was dreaming now. Maybe about dinosaurs. Maybe about nothing at all. He didn't know what was happening outside this aircraft. Didn't know that his grandmother had just set off a chain reaction across 7 nations. Didn't know that her silence was being dissected in conference rooms by people paid 7 figures to anticipate risk. All he knew was that he felt safe next to her, and that's all she needed tonight. She typed a short response. Maintain holding pattern. Begin anonymized case study protocol, which meant let them stew. Let the system correct itself, without headlines. The woman across the aisle turned slightly, as if working up the courage to speak. Nadine looked at her. Finally. Not with malice. Not even with disappointment. Just recognition. She had seen this face before. Not Rebecca's face, specifically, but the expression. That complicated mix of guilt, confusion, and shame people wore when they realized they'd been centering the wrong person in the story. Rebecca opened her mouth, but Nadine gently raised one hand. Not rudely, just enough. Rebecca's lips parted, then closed. She nodded, and in that quiet acknowledgement, something settled, not resolved, but seen, which, for once, was enough. The aircraft continued through the night. Outside, the stars were veiled behind the curve of the earth. Inside, the cabin slept, but power didn't. It moved, quietly, deliberately, with the authority of a woman who didn't raise her voice to shift a system. She simply built the structure, then let it do the talking. By the time Flight 815 crossed the Atlantic midpoint, 37,000 feet above silent black ocean, the first consequence had already landed. In a terminal office tucked behind Gate 12 at Toronto Pearson International Airport, a supervisor scanned a live integrity flag. Halcyon 815, Carter protocol trigger confirmed. Begin delay review on inbound flights from the carrier. Suspension pending Tier 2. He didn't call anyone. He didn't check with legal. He didn't need to. The name Carter on a GIEC code was enough. Not because it was political, but because it was proven. In the last 3 years, flights flagged under Nadine Carter's protocol had cost 3 carriers over $400 million in sustainability-linked investments. The damage hadn't been immediate. It hadn't needed to be. Because when Nadine moved, she didn't send waves. She installed fault lines. And then, let people walk over them themselves. Inside Halcyon Airlines Operations Center in Incheon, a woman named Soo Jin, head of international compliance, pulled up the real-time dashboard. Red nodes blinked softly next to 6 flagged routes. She tapped twice and escalated the Lisbon-New York corridor to status watch. Across her screen, a Carter-triggered compliance sweep began silently compiling. Cabin crew bias markers, passenger interaction logs, gate check-in discrepancies. It wasn't just about what happened in the air. It was about patterns. At JFK, the duty manager was already assembling his ethics response team. He hadn't even received the official flag yet. He just knew it was coming. Because Carter didn't bluff. And the protocol never moved alone. It brought mirrors. And those were harder to survive than headlines. Back inside the cabin, Nadine Carter remained motionless. The tray table before her was still clean. Her glass of water untouched since the last turbulence check. She didn't need to move, because her stillness had already spoken louder than anyone expected. Micah shifted beside her, stretching slightly, then blinking awake. "Nana," he whispered, voice groggy. "Are we almost there?" "Not quite," she said softly. "Another few hours." He yawned, looked around, then leaned in close. "Why do people keep looking at you?" Nadine smiled. "They're just thinking. Baby." "About what?" She glanced across the aisle. Rebecca's eyes were fixed out the window again. The sky had begun to tint indigo now. That strange pre-dawn light that makes the horizon look like memory. "Sometimes," Nadine said gently, "people notice things too late, and then they have to sit with that." Micah nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. He had seen things before that other kids hadn't. His mother's illness. The silence around her death. The way strangers had spoken to Nadine at school pickup. The way they'd ask if she was the tutor, the housekeeper, the guardian. Never the matriarch. He had learned early that titles didn't protect you from assumptions, but posture, presence, patterns. They did something else. He reached for his sketch pad and began drawing again. It was a habit, a grounding. He drew cities in the sky, floating roads, buildings with wings. Nadine watched for a moment, who then turned her eyes forward. Rebecca Langston, across the aisle, didn't pretend to read anymore. She was sitting back in her seat, arms crossed lightly. Her posture had changed. She looked cracked, not broken, just unsettled. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said. Nadine didn't answer. She didn't even look. Rebecca tried again. "I've worked in finance for 30 years. I sit on 2 nonprofit boards. My daughter's best friend is black." That part came out faster than she meant. She winced. The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was indifferent. Because Nadine had nothing to prove, and Rebecca had nothing to repair that could be accepted on demand. Moments like this weren't fixed with clarification. They were carried inside her chest. Rebecca felt something she hadn't felt in years. Irrelevance, not from Nadine, but from the structure Nadine had awakened. For the first time in decades, Rebecca Langston realized that her discomfort wasn't the center of the story, and that the consequences in motion weren't waiting for her understanding. They had already begun. At Halcyon's Chicago office, Jonas Merrill stood by the window in his executive suite, staring out over the river. Behind him, his PR chief read from a drafted statement. "We deeply regret the incident involving perceived disrespect on one of our international flights. Halcyon Airlines is committed to dignity at every level of service." Jonas scoffed. Perceived. We can't use that word. Why not? Because it's not about what we perceive. It's about what she noticed. The PR chief paused. Do we name her? No. We don't draw her in. She didn't make a scene. She made a move. And if we try to explain it, we'll just prove her point. Silence again. He ran a hand over his face. "I thought these things were all politics. Performative. They used to be." The PR chief said. "She changed that." The legal team chimed in. "The fastest way forward is compliance and acknowledgement. No defensiveness. No conditions. Accept the audit. Fund the ethics retraining initiative. Get in front of the GIEC press cycle." Jonas nodded slowly. He wasn't angry anymore. He was focused. Because Nadine Carter didn't want an apology. She had power, and that was harder to negotiate with. Back on the plane. Eva, the young flight attendant, approached Nadine again. This time slower. No tray in hand. Just a presence. "Dr. Carter," she whispered. Nadine looked up. "I know you probably hear this all the time, but I wanted to say thank you. Your framework changed my cousin's scholarship eligibility. She's in aviation school now because of what you built." Nadine offered the smallest smile. "Tell her to finish strong." Eva nodded, eyes misting, then returned to the galley. Micah glanced up from his sketch pad. "Nana, were you a teacher?" Nadine considered that. "No," she said slowly. "I just helped people remember things they forgot mattered. Like what she brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. Like how people should be treated." He looked back down and kept coloring. At 35,000 feet. The world hadn't changed, but its balance had shifted. By the time they began descent into New York, 7 international airports had flagged Halcyon's incoming flights for temporary status review. 3 ESG funds had suspended capital exposure. 2 airports had reclassified their gate leases pending dignity compliance. And no one had heard a single public word from Nadine Carter, because she didn't need a podium to create policy. She didn't need a microphone to issue correction. She just had to sit still and let the protocol speak in her place. The descent hadn't begun yet, but something had already begun landing. Not the aircraft, something quieter, heavier, the weight of knowing. It moved through the cabin like a draft. You couldn't see it, couldn't name it, but you could feel the difference in how people blinked slower, how their hands stilled on seat backs, how their voices dropped one register below casual. Flight 815 was now 6 hours into its journey, and nothing dramatic had happened. No confrontation, no raised voices, no video footage gone viral. But everyone who had been watching, even passively, now carried something new in their posture. Recognition, not of a scandal, but of a shift. The young tech worker in row 3, who had watched the boarding unfold with distracted curiosity, now sat with his laptop closed. His attention had drifted, not just toward Nadine, but inward. He remembered the time last year when he had assumed the older black woman in his building was the cleaning supervisor. She had actually been the property owner. He never apologized. He just moved out quietly. In the seat behind Nadine, a man in his 40s, pale, balding, wedding ring twisted nervously on his finger, kept staring at the back of her head. He couldn't explain why he was watching her. Just that he felt something shift in him when the flight attendant said Dr. Carter out loud. Something uncomfortable. Something earned. People weren't whispering. That would have made it easier. What they were doing was worse. They were thinking. For some, it was the first time they'd questioned what happened when a black woman walked onto a plane alone with a child. For others, it was the slow realization that they'd never had to carry their titles like armor. Nadine didn't look around. She didn't need to. She could feel it in the way the flight attendants now offered her things twice, each time with precision. The warmth in their eyes wasn't natural. It was correction. She wasn't offended. She was exhausted. She had grown up in these patterns. First, the dismissal, then the recalibration, then the overcompensation. She preferred the first one. At least it was honest. Michael was still sketching. This time, he was drawing a long table with people seated around it, people with wings instead of arms, passing scrolls between them. A government of angels, maybe. She watched his hand work with such ease. It reminded her of his mother. Alicia used to draw buildings with no doors, only windows. When Nadine asked her why, she said, because sometimes people don't want to be entered. They just want to be seen. She missed her more than she let on. Across the aisle, Rebecca Langston sipped from a glass of wine she didn't remember ordering. It had gone warm. She drank it anyway. She hadn't spoken since her soft attempt at apology. She'd given up trying to explain herself, but she hadn't stopped thinking. What disturbed her most wasn't that she had made an assumption. It was that it had happened so fast. A glance, a question, a conclusion, all shaped by decades of quiet conditioning she'd never had to name out loud. She realized now that politeness had been her shield. She had always prided herself on being gracious. But grace without awareness wasn't kindness. It was camouflage, and she had worn it proudly. Until now. She didn't know what to do with this awareness. She didn't know how to sit with her own discomfort without demanding something from Nadine and return a gesture, a smile, a forgiveness she hadn't earned. So instead, she sat in silence, and that was a beginning, a few rows back. Eva, the young flight attendant, leaned against the galley wall, biting her thumbnail. She kept replaying her first approach to Nadine in her mind. She hadn't said anything wrong, but now she wondered if it had been too familiar, too casual? Had she addressed her with enough respect? Had she tried too hard to show admiration and ended up performing it? She glanced over her shoulder. Nadine hadn't moved. Still composed, still unreadable. Eva felt a chill rise in her spine. Not fear, just responsibility. She pulled out her small tablet and logged into the crew feedback app. There was a section labeled Unlearning Log Optional, Private, for internal growth. She typed slowly. Today I witnessed something. A moment of quiet correction. A woman everyone almost missed changed the room without raising her voice. I think I need to sit with how often I've assumed power looks like me. She hit save. Didn't share it with anyone. Just kept it. And that was also a beginning. In Halcyon's digital ethics portal, Nadine's profile now had a blinking tag next to it. Priority integrity case. Watchlist level 1. This didn't mean scandal. It meant learn, adjust, respond. Already. Halcyon's internal team was pulling every moment of gate footage from Lisbon, every crew interaction, every micro gesture logged by new biometric systems installed under GIEC guidelines. They weren't looking for overt misconduct. They were mapping bias. And that, in this new age of silent accountability, was enough. Nadine checked the time. They were nearing the first marker of descent. She opened her tablet and reviewed the case notes from a recent investigation into a different airline, one where a Muslim woman had been detained mid-flight for changing seats to be closer to her child. The review had led to sweeping policy change, quietly, without press. She preferred it that way. She had no appetite for outrage. What she had was stamina. She noticed Micah had paused his drawing. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly. He turned to her, brows pinched. "How come they act different now? Who the people on the plane? They look at you different." She considered how to explain something that wasn't really visible. "They didn't see me fully before," she said. "Now they're realizing they missed something. Like your name, like my place." Micah leaned closer. "They were wrong." Nadine nodded. "Yes, but what matters more is what they do next. Are you going to tell them what to do?" She smiled gently. "I don't need to. The systems are already doing the talking." Micah nodded, though he didn't quite understand. But he trusted her, and that was enough. The intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent into New York shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. Cabin crew, secure the cabin." People stirred. Reclined seats were straightened, window shades lifted. But the energy in the cabin had changed. No one dared glance at Nadine now out of pity or fascination. They looked because they were learning. And she didn't need to teach. She simply sat, unmoved, unfolded, undeniable. And that echoed all the way to the ground. The wheels hadn't touched the ground yet, but the turbulence had already begun, not in the sky, but in perception. At 7040 MOM Eastern Time, as Flight 815 passed over Atlantic City, the term GIEC Clause 7B began trending in closed ESG investor channels. By 7:00, a journalist at a New York policy blog received a text: "She's moving. Halcyon's the target." By 7:12, 3 major equity funds began drafting contingency briefs. None of this had reached the public. Not yet, but reputations rarely break in public first. They splinter in back rooms and Slack threads, in quiet nods between powerful people who realize their alliances have shifted. And today, Halcyon Airlines had just been reclassified from resilient to watchlist. On the aircraft, descent had officially begun. The nose tilted slightly downward, The engines shifted tone. Tray tables were locked. Seat backs clicked upright. Outside, the sun had begun its ascent over New York City. The light crept along the curve of the earth like a slow reveal. Gold cracked against glass, and shadows stretched across the first-class cabin. Nadine Carter closed her tablet. She didn't need to monitor the systems anymore. They were already listening. Micah looked out the window, mouth slightly open. "Wow," he whispered. She followed his gaze. Skyscrapers were visible in the distance now. Tiny, geometric, perfect. "That's New York. That's home," she said. "Looks like a toy city. It does from up here. But down there, everything's louder." He nodded, eyes wide. He had no idea what his grandmother had done during this flight, and she preferred it that way. Let him hold on to wonder a little longer. Across the aisle, Rebecca Langston had begun composing a note on her phone, then deleting it, then trying again. The words didn't come easy. How do you apologize for being ordinary in your ignorance, for being educated but blind, for seeing a woman with grace and a child and deciding she must be less, not more? She knew better. She had known better. And still, she had defaulted to comfort, and that made the shame worse. She glanced at Nadine once, hoping to find something, a softening, a clue. But Nadine's expression was unchanged, composed, patient, like someone accustomed to bearing the burden of other people's awakenings. Rebecca looked back at her phone and deleted the message again. This apology wasn't hers to write. Not yet. In the Halcyon boardroom in Manhattan, Jonas Merrill stood beside a screen projecting Flight 81V's estimated landing time. "We have 4 hours," he said to the executives gathered. "To do what the CFO asked." Jonas turned. To stay in the conversation. The room was tense. Every executive had received overnight briefings. The GIEC flag, the Clause 7B, the ESG freeze from 3 regional partners, and worst of all, the silence from Nadine Carter. She hadn't spoken publicly, not a word, and that made it 10 times harder, because now they were responding not to a crisis, but to a question, one they hadn't prepared for. What does a company do when dignity moves faster than PR? Their legal advisor spoke next. "If we issue a preemptive apology, we admit fault. We'd be better off." "We're not issuing a legal defense," Jonas interrupted. "We're issuing a moral signal." He tapped his pen against the table. "She didn't threaten us. She didn't name us. She didn't record the flight or tweet. She trusted the protocol we built together. And now we either prove it works or we prove she was right to doubt it." Silence. Then the communications director spoke. "Launch the audit. Voluntarily, publicly. Include the entire Lisbon to New York route in the scope. Interview staff. Release anonymized data logs." Jonas nodded. "And restructure the board's DEI committee. I want it chaired by someone external, someone credible." Another voice chimed in. "Should we reach out to her directly?" Jonas thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "She doesn't want a seat at our table. She built the table. We just forgot to keep our elbows off it." Back on Flight 815, the intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach into JFK International Airport. Local time is 7:32 a.m., and the temperature on the ground is 66 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The landing gear clicked into place. Micah gripped the armrest slightly, unsure if it was excitement or nerves. Nadine placed a calming hand over his. "You're okay," she said. He nodded. The plane tilted again, slightly. New York loomed larger now, its edges no longer blurred. The city had texture, cracks, color, and somewhere in that city, systems were already adjusting their course. Because when power reveals itself without threat, it lingers longer. At the Global Infrastructure and Ethics Council's central office, Naomi Reyes read the data dashboard with quiet pride. Protocol 7B had completed its cycle. No errors, no pushback, no misuse. The audit had begun. The fund shifts were underway. No damage had been done to a person, only to a structure that had taken her too lightly. And that, Naomi knew, was Nadine's true genius. She never humiliated people. She let their systems tell on themselves. The plane touched down with a soft thud. Tires screeched gently against tarmac. Micah let out a small whoop, then grinned up at his grandmother. "You did it," he said. Nadine laughed under her breath. "I think we did it." The plane taxied slowly. Nadine reached for her coat, brushing off invisible dust. The flight attendant stood by, more formal than usual. Their eyes didn't just reflect politeness, now they held something closer to reverence, not because of her title, but because of the atmosphere she had created, the kind that stayed with people long after they deplaned. As passengers began to rise and collect their belongings, Nadine remained seated. She always waited. Let the rush pass. Micah gathered his sketchbook and crayons, stuffing them into his backpack with clumsy joy. Outside, the morning was unfolding. Inside, an entire industry had just shifted 2 degrees toward accountability, and Nadine had said almost nothing. She stood slowly, smoothed her scarf, checked her grandson's seatbelt buckle one last time, out of habit. As she turned toward the aisle, Rebecca Langston finally spoke again. It wasn't much, just 2 words. "Thank you." Nadine paused, not to answer, just to acknowledge that the echo had reached its final point, and with a slight nod, she stepped forward. The cabin door opened, and the woman who had been mistaken for a nanny walked off the plane as the most powerful ethical architect in aviation. Not with applause, not with cameras, just with legacy in her stride. Rebecca Langston stepped off the jet bridge into Terminal 4 with her carry-on bag rolling behind her, the wheels thudding lightly across the tiles. The morning crowd was a blur: business travelers, families, students. Everything moved with the energy of early ambition. But Rebecca moved slower. It wasn't her body that felt heavy. It was something deeper. She was used to landing with purpose, phone in hand, conference on the calendar, coffee order rehearsed. But this morning, the phone stayed inside her coat pocket. She hadn't checked her email since Lisbon. She didn't even want to. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't racing toward her day. She was retreating from something unnamed. Or maybe something she could finally name, but wish she couldn't. The image of Nadine Carter, calm, graceful, seated beside her grandson, was etched into her memory like frost across glass. But it wasn't just Nadine's poise that haunted her. It was her own reflection in the encounter. What had she said? "Are you the nanny?" Rebecca's stomach turned again. She had said it with the tone of someone trying to be kind, trying to be helpful, trying to smile. And yet the words had emerged from a place she didn't want to admit still lived in her, a place that sorted people too quickly, that defaulted to stereotypes even as she donated to every cause that swore to dismantle them. She kept walking. The terminal smelled of espresso and jet fuel. A family argued softly near the baggage carousel. A businessman barked into a headset about a delayed town car. Rebecca moved through it all like a ghost. She reached the rideshare pickup lane and pulled out her phone. Typed in the address of her midtown apartment. The car was 5 minutes away. She stood near a pillar, arms crossed tightly. But she couldn't stop replaying the moment when Nadine had looked at her. Not with anger, not even pity, just clarity. It had been worse than if she'd yelled, because it had revealed Rebecca to herself, and now she couldn't unsee it. She thought about her daughter, Morgan, a junior at Brown, passionate about race and gender studies, always challenging her on her language, her assumptions. Morgan would be furious if she ever found out. But she wouldn't find out, because Rebecca would never tell her. This was a private kind of reckoning, one that demanded more than an apology. It demanded reconfiguration. The car arrived. She climbed in silently, gave the driver a soft thank you, and leaned her head against the window as the skyline blurred past. She didn't feel like going home, so she asked the driver to stop at Bryant Park. She needed to sit somewhere that didn't move. The bench was cold but welcoming. The morning had ripened into soft sun, and a few people sipped coffee nearby. A woman pushed a stroller. 2 teenagers laughed too loud. Normalcy, except nothing felt normal. Rebecca pulled out her phone again, opened her Notes app. For a moment, she just stared at the blank screen. Then slowly, she began to type. Unspoken things I learned on Flight 815. 1. Having a doctorate doesn't protect you from being misjudged. 2. A pearl bracelet and a smile can still carry bias. 3. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is strategy. 4. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits for systems to trip over it. 5. Being liberal doesn't make you innocent. 6. Watching someone correct a system without a word is the most humbling thing I've ever seen. She stopped, deleted the last one, typed it again. 6. I watched a black woman hold the entire aviation industry accountable using nothing but her stillness, and I almost called her the help. She stared at the line. Her hands trembled slightly. She saved the note, locked the phone, and placed it face down on the bench beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't deserve that kind of release yet. Instead, she closed her eyes and let herself sit in the discomfort. That, at least, was honest. Meanwhile, back at JFK's executive lounge, Nadine Carter waited beside a private exit. A driver would be pulling around shortly to take her and Micah to the Upper West Side, where her brownstone awaited bookshelves full of policy journals, toy dinosaurs, family photos, and one framed quote from her late daughter: "If the world refuses to hear us, then let it be reshaped by the sound of our footsteps instead." Micah leaned against her leg, munching a breakfast bar from his bag. "Nana," he said between bites, "was that lady your friend?" Nadine looked down. "Which one?" "The one in the seat across from us. The one who kept looking funny." "No, baby," she said gently. "She wasn't a friend." "Was she mean?" "No, just still learning." "Like in school," Nadine smiled. "Yes, just like school." "Is she going to get in trouble?" Nadine thought about that. No, but her view of the world might change. Micah nodded, like that made perfect sense. "I hope it gets better." Nadine ruffled his curls. "Me too." The car arrived, and they slid into the back seat. As the city rose around them, Nadine leaned back and closed her eyes. She wasn't tired. She was full of the kind of quiet affirmation that doesn't need recognition to validate its presence. She had done what needed to be done, without shouting, without spectacle. And the echoes of that stillness were just beginning, in offices, in inboxes, in park benches, in the hearts of people who had no idea they were being asked to grow until they were made to sit still and feel it. Even the other woman, especially her. By noon, the email had landed in Nadine Carter's inbox. Subject line request for listening session. Halcyon Airlines. It was polite, overly polite, which usually meant careful, which almost always meant afraid. The sender was Jonas Merrill, CEO of Halcyon Airlines. He thanked her for her continued commitment to dignity and transparency in global travel. He referenced the mutual history between their organizations. He emphasized his desire to listen, learn, and move forward responsibly. He offered a private room at the New York Ethics Consortium building. No press, no minutes, just a closed-door opportunity for mutual understanding. Nadine read the message twice. Micah was in the other room watching a dinosaur documentary and eating sliced pears. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She didn't want to go. Not because she was angry. She wasn't. But because she didn't need this meeting. Her protocol had already done its job. Systems were recalibrating. Partners were reevaluating. The pressure was applied exactly where it needed to be. Still, she could hear Alicia's voice again. Some rooms don't need your presence. They need your shadow. But if you go on your terms. Nadine tapped a response. Short, direct. I'll come. 1 hour. You listen. 3 hours later. She walked through the glass doors of the Ethics Consortium in Midtown, her heels quiet against the marble. Jonas was already waiting in the conference room. He stood quickly when she entered. Nadine, thank you for agreeing to. I didn't come for gratitude, she said, and I won't stay long. He nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. She sat slowly, removing her gloves. Also in the room were Halcyon's legal counsel, its director of DEI, and a note-taker who looked too nervous to breathe. Nadine scanned their faces. Calm as glass, Jonas started, I want to begin by acknowledging the seriousness of what happened. Or rather, what didn't happen and should have. She said nothing. We failed to recognize you, not just as an individual, but as a signal of everything we claimed to support. And that failure, small as it may have seemed in the moment, was systemic. Still, she didn't respond. He shifted in his seat. We've initiated a full audit of our staff training modules, restructured our dignity assurance metrics, and paused all non-compliant international hiring pipelines pending third-party evaluation. Nadine spoke at last. Those are good starts, but they're not for me. They're for your conscience. Jonas blinked. I'm not here to be appeased, she continued. You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourselves a reckoning. The legal counsel shifted uncomfortably. Jonas nodded slowly. We understand that, but we also understand the power of presence, and yours changes rooms. She tilted her head. It didn't change yours until after you were exposed. He looked down. I suppose that's true. It's always been true. A pause. Jonas leaned forward slightly. We'd like to offer you a formal role. Consultant to our ethics redesign team. Public-facing, advisory, if you prefer. She raised an eyebrow. You're offering me a seat at a table you didn't invite me to board. He opened his mouth to answer. She held up a hand. I'm not interested in being a symbol, or a scapegoat, or a savior. Another pause. But, she said, I am interested in legacy. Jonas sat back, uncertain. What would that look like to you? She looked directly at the DEI director now. Triple your investment in dignity monitoring systems, not quarterly reports, real-time transparency. Publish your bias indicators publicly. Let your passengers know they're not just consumers. They're observers. The DEI director nodded quickly, scribbling. And, Nadine continued, turning back to Jonas, you will establish a passenger equity trust. It won't be run by Halcyon. It will be independent. Its mission will be education and restoration, not damage control. Jonas hesitated. That's a large ask. It's not an ask, Nadine replied. It's the cost of catching up. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Outside the glass room, the city pulsed. Inside, Legacy rewrote itself. Jonas took a breath. Done, he said. We'll make it happen. Nadine stood. I'll believe it when I don't have to watch. As she gathered her coat, the legal counsel asked softly, Why didn't you speak out louder? Nadine looked at her, measured, because it's not the shouting that scares institutions. It's the silence. It means you don't know what I'm planning. With that, she walked out. The room remained still long after she left. Half a mile away, Micah sat with his sketchbook at a cafe table, flanked by two baristas who'd offered him free hot chocolate and were now admiring his drawing of a dinosaur courtroom. He looked up as Nadine approached. Nana, he called. I gave the judge a tail. She smiled. That seems fair. He held up the sketch. The judge had scales, glasses, and a gavel. Behind him sat 12 jurors, animals, birds, people, all listening, all still, and in that silly, beautiful image, Nadine saw the world she'd always worked for, one where judgment wasn't about power. It was about truth in motion. She sat beside Micah, rested her palm over his hand. He leaned in close. Did you fix it? She considered the question. No, she said, but I helped them hear what needs fixing. He nodded solemnly, then turned back to his sketch. The coffee shop buzzed with soft conversation. The world outside kept turning, but somewhere beneath the concrete, the foundation had cracked open just a little, enough to let light in. And that, Nadine knew, was how systems changed, not all at once, but one conversation, one stillness at a time. The story didn't lead the morning news. It wasn't splashed across television screens, breaking into daytime talk shows or trending hashtags. There were no leaked videos, no grainy footage of the moment Nadine Carter was mistaken for a nanny. There was no confrontation to share, no soundbite to replay. And yet, by the end of the week, the aviation industry had begun to shift. Quietly, reluctantly, precisely the way Nadine had designed it to. The first article to mention her name was buried in the middle of an ESG investor newsletter. Halcyon Airlines initiates silent audit after flag from Dr. Nadine Carter protocol. The piece was cautious, data-heavy, intentionally vague. It mentioned changes to cabin training, equity checkpoints, and a new independent oversight initiative called the Passenger Equity Trust. Nadine's name was printed only once, but it was enough. Within 72 hours, 6 other articles followed, not about the flight itself, but about what had happened afterward. How an anonymous internal flag led to 3 airport partnership reevaluations. How a private meeting at the New York Ethics Consortium triggered the largest compliance donation in Halcyon's history. How 3 CEOs from rival airlines reportedly asked if they had any Carter vulnerabilities in their customer experience funnels. No one could find a quote from Nadine, because there wasn't one. She hadn't tweeted. She hadn't written a letter. She hadn't published a think piece or granted interviews. She simply declined. Her publicist confirmed that she was not seeking media engagement at this time. That was all. Still, the narrative grew, because power, when used with precision, doesn't need volume. It echoes anyway. At the corporate headquarters of a different airline, an executive team sat around a long oak table. "Do we have exposure?" someone asked. "We've never had a Carter protocol activated," another replied, "but our dignity audit's 10 months overdue." The COO leaned forward. I don't care if we're not on her radar. We need to act like we are. And so the dominoes began falling in meetings Nadine would never attend. Across panels, HR initiatives, and executive offsites. Phrases like implicit dignity failures and nonverbal accountability mechanisms became new corporate lingo. A nonprofit advocacy group updated their recommendations for first-class crew training based directly on the design of Nadine's PDAM system. Someone made a slide deck about it. Someone else built a workshop. A university ethics course added it to their syllabus, all without her asking, all without her face on a screen. She wasn't the center of the story, but she was its quiet spine. At home, Nadine didn't celebrate. She didn't pour champagne or write in a journal. Instead, she sat in the living room while Micah built a tower of wooden blocks beside her. He was humming to himself a tune from a cartoon, maybe, or something he'd made up. She watched him stack each piece carefully, balancing height and weight. "You know," she said, "you're an architect." He looked up, grinning. "Like buildings, like structures," she said. "You're designing how things stand." He placed one final block on top and whispered, "Done." Then knocked it over on purpose and laughed. She smiled, resting her chin in her hand. Alicia used to do the same thing, build something. Knock it down. Build it again, as if to prove that nothing sacred was fragile. Later that night, Nadine sat on her balcony with a cup of tea, the city stretching below her in silence. She hadn't told many people what happened on that flight. Only Naomi Reyes, her deputy at the Global Ethics Council, knew the full details, and Naomi hadn't pried. All she had said was, "It's being handled. You were seen." That was enough. Still, the silence pressed around Nadine like a second skin. She knew the world wanted a story, but she didn't owe them one. If anything, she owed herself the quiet. The next day, a journalist named Zara Chen sent her a personal message. Zara wasn't just another voice in media. She was meticulous, known for her restraint, for choosing stories that mattered more than they trended. Her email was respectful. "I understand you've chosen not to speak. If that remains your wish, I won't pursue. But I also believe this moment matters not for scandal, but for the architecture of dignity. If you ever decide to put it into words, I'd be honored to listen." Nadine didn't respond right away. She sat with it. She appreciated the tone, the absence of urgency, but she didn't know if she had anything new to say. What could be said about a system that needed your silence to hear itself? She thought back to the woman on the plane, Rebecca Langston. She had stayed quiet during the descent, but her face had carried something Nadine had seen before: shame trying to grow into responsibility. It wasn't progress yet, but it was weight-bearing. Sometimes, that's all you could hope for. 2 days later, Nadine received a box. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. For what you didn't say and how loudly it spoke. Below it, a folded print of a sketch. 12 people around a table. A woman seated at the head, silent. Behind her wings, Micah's drawing. She smiled. So Rebecca had found a way to speak after all. She placed the sketch on her mantle, beside Alicia's quote, "Not for display, for memory, because not all echoes are made to be heard. Some are made to be carried." That evening, Nadine opened a new document on her laptop. She didn't title it. She didn't know if she would ever publish it. She just began writing. Not a speech, not a defense. Just a ledger of all the times power disguised itself as silence, and all the times that silence reshaped the room. Micah called from the hallway. "Nana, come look." She closed the laptop and went. Because legacy wasn't built only in boardrooms or audits. It was also built in living rooms, between bedtime stories and block towers, in children who watch the world more clearly than the adults around them, in quiet drawings sent without signatures, and in stories never printed but never forgotten. 2 weeks after Flight 815 touched down at JFK, 7 major international airports released synchronized press statements, each one different in language, but identical in intention. They weren't reacting to an incident. They were installing a new system. Lisbon, Chicago O'Hare, Abu Dhabi, Incheon, Toronto Pearson, Dublin, JFK, 7 terminals, across 5 countries and 3 continents, announced formal integration of the Carter Protocol into their passenger treatment architecture. They didn't call it a policy change. They called it a realignment, because something deeper than a policy had shifted. It wasn't just about race. It wasn't just about first class. It was about the invisible math of how people were seen and unseen across the infrastructures of modern travel. Each terminal released its own version of the Carter Compliance Statement. Passengers are not hierarchies. Dignity cannot be pre-assumed. Perception must be trained. Those 3 lines, lifted directly from Nadine's unpublished 2022 framework, became the new gold standard for behavioral evaluation across partner carriers. It was unprecedented, not because a new policy had arrived, but because no one had protested it. There were no protests in boardrooms, no union pushback, no legal stonewalling, because Nadine hadn't arrived as a demand. She'd arrived as a mirror, and no one wanted to argue with their reflection. In a conference room in Toronto, a young black operations analyst named Amina scrolled through the formal rollout. She whispered finally under her breath. She remembered the time she had escorted her mother to a business-class lounge, only to be questioned about whether she was accompanying a patient. She remembered the embarrassment in her mother's smile, the way she laughed it off to protect her daughter from the sting. Now, years later, that memory was no longer just a wound. It was part of the reason systems were being rearranged. Amina clicked submit on her internal feedback form. I hope Dr. Carter knows what she did for us. At the same moment, 500-600 miles away in Seoul, a security supervisor rewrote the training curriculum for new staff. His notes began with a directive. Do not assume. Do not perform kindness. Practice presence. He didn't mention Nadine's name, but her fingerprints were in every line. Meanwhile, Nadine herself watched it all unfold from her kitchen table. Micah was doing homework across from her, mumbling about fractions and chewing the end of his pencil. The television was on low in the background. A reporter mentioned the Carter Protocol in passing during a segment on evolving customer standards. Nadine didn't flinch. She didn't beam with pride. She simply kept peeling her apple, one slice at a time, placing each piece in a small bowl for Micah. He looked up. Nana, do you think everyone will be nicer on planes now? She smiled faintly. Some people will, she said. Some systems will make it harder not to be. He nodded like that made perfect sense. Do you think the lady from the flight is still thinking about us? I think she's thinking about herself. And is that bad? No, Nadine said. It's the only way we grow. She thought about Rebecca Langston often, not with resentment, but with curiosity. What would she do with the knowledge she'd gained? Would she speak out, stay quiet, reorient? How she navigated the world. Sometimes, change isn't loud. It happens when someone hesitates before they speak, when they choose a different word, when they question their own assumptions. Rebecca might never thank her again. That was fine. The goal had never been personal. It had always been structural. at the Global Ethics Council. Naomi Reyes updated their internal tracker. Since the incident, inquiries about implementing the Carter Protocol had increased by 440%. The acronym BDM was now embedded in over 60 corporate onboarding frameworks, airlines, hotels, port authorities, even tech companies. One message read, "We don't want this because it's popular. We want it because we missed it, and we don't want to miss it again." Naomi leaned back in her chair. She had worked with Nadine for 6 years, watched her navigate policy like a surgeon cutting precisely, knowing exactly where to apply pressure without drawing unnecessary blood. Nadine never shamed people. She shamed systems, and that made her unstoppable. She picked up her phone and typed a message. "The world is rearranging itself around your silence, and somehow it's louder than any campaign we've ever launched." Nadine read the message a few minutes later and smiled. She typed back simply, "It was never about noise. It was about permission." That evening, Zara Chen finally published a column. It wasn't an expose. It wasn't a headline. It was a letter, not from Nadine, but to her. What do we owe the woman who did not demand anything and still got everything to move? We owe her our recalibration. We owe her our awareness. We owe her better questions, better systems, and the decency not to wait until someone like her walks onto a plane to remember our duty to see everyone clearly. The piece went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it articulated what so many had been feeling: the discomfort, the reflection, the quiet shift. In comment sections, people didn't argue. They confessed. "I've asked the wrong questions to the wrong people before. I assumed. I didn't mean to. But I did. I never said it out loud. But I've thought it. And now I know better." Nadine didn't read every comment. She didn't need to. Change doesn't always look like parades. Sometimes it looks like people holding up mirrors to themselves and not flinching. In the weeks that followed, a new clause was added to the GIEC's Global Charter. All participating institutions must have a mechanism to listen to dignity without waiting for it to raise its voice. They named it after her, Clause Carter 12. She didn't attend the signing ceremony. Instead, she was at home, helping Micah with a school project about birds. He'd chosen swans. They looked quiet, he said, but strong. She smiled. "That's the best kind." Later, as the boy slept and the house went still, Nadine stood at her window. The city stretched out beneath her like a breathing organism, and somewhere down there, someone was being misjudged. Someone was being assumed into a smaller shape. But maybe, just maybe, the person watching would pause. Maybe the system around them would redirect. And maybe, instead of another apology years too late, there'd be a moment of correction that didn't require injury to be real. She didn't need to control every outcome. She just needed to build enough architecture to hold people while they learned. A system rearranged itself that month, not because someone yelled, but because someone had been still and the world had finally learned how to listen. The contract was only 4 pages, cleanly formatted, no embellishments, no decorative headers, just words, sharp and plain and final. At the bottom of the last page, there was a signature line already printed with her name, Dr. Nadine Carter. Above it, a single sentence in bold: "This protocol shall be sustained by action, not presence." That had been her condition. Not one-time consulting, not honorary titles. Sustainability. The system she had helped shape needed to outlast her silence, her fame, even her existence. If a legacy required her to stay visible, to remain relevant, it wasn't a legacy, It was a spotlight. Nadine never wanted that. What she wanted was a permanent shift. Today, she would sign, not for recognition, but to finish the work. The room was warm, filled with quiet respect. 3 members of the Global Ethics Council sat to one side. Jonas Merrill beside them, less formal than before. No cameras, no press, just verification. Micah sat in a corner with his sketch pad, occasionally looking up from his drawing to smile at his grandmother as she signed the final page. She felt no rush of emotion, just completion. Naomi Reyes spoke softly. This makes it official. The Carter Clause will be built into the international standard for passenger dignity across all 7 airport hubs, Jonas added. We've also arranged for an annual audit not to test if we followed your model, but to test if we honored your intent. Nadine looked up. And how will you measure that? He paused, thoughtful. We'll ask the people who never speak. She nodded once. That was the right answer. After the signing, no one clapped. It didn't feel necessary. Outside the glass window, the city continued as it always had, taxis weaving, people rushing, clouds passing over rooftops. Legacy didn't look different from regular life. It just made regular life kinder. That afternoon, Nadine and Micah walked home together, hand in hand, past bookstores and fruit vendors and a woman singing jazz in a cracked velvet coat. Micah carried a rolled-up sketch under his arm. "What's in today's drawing?" she asked. He grinned. "It's a courtroom again. But this time it's in the sky." "In the sky." "Yeah, like the clouds are seats, and the judge is floating. Sounds magical." "It's fairer up there," he said. "Nobody's taller than anyone else." She smiled, squeezing his hand. Micah had inherited Alicia's eye for symbolism, a world reshaped through image, not just argument. At home, they sat on the balcony, watching the late sun melt into amber over the buildings. Micah was quiet for a while, then asked, "Nana, are you famous now?" Nadine turned toward him, brow raised. "What makes you ask that I saw your name on the news scroll yesterday? What did it say? Just your name. And the word standard." She laughed gently. "Well, that's not fame. That's function." He tilted his head. "What's the difference?" She thought for a moment. "Fame is people looking at you. Function is what happens when they stop looking and the work keeps going." Micah considered that. "Then I think function is better." "So do I." He smiled, content with the answer. A few days later, Nadine received a small package. No sender listed. Inside a copy of Zara Chen's column, laminated and folded, with a short handwritten note for classrooms, not just headlines. Nadine placed it inside a leather folder beside her daughter's college essays and Micah's first drawing of the Carter Protocol. She didn't frame it, she stored it, because legacy wasn't something to show off. It was something to build on. The next week, she was invited to speak at a closed-door summit of education leaders and youth policy advocates. She almost declined, but Micah convinced her. "You don't have to give a speech," he said. "Just show them how you listen." And so, she went. She didn't present slides. She didn't bring notes. She sat in a circle with 12 educators and 24 students from 8 countries and asked them a single question. What does dignity feel like when no one is watching? The conversation lasted 4 hours. By the end, one student cried. Another wrote a poem. A professor changed the name of their course syllabus from cultural sensitivity to structural seeing. That was enough. Nadine didn't attend the final dinner. She went home instead. She and Micah baked cornbread and watched a documentary about migratory birds. "Did you know," Micah said with his mouth full, That swans remember migration routes from when they were babies? I didn't. And if the lead bird gets lost, another one just takes over. That's beautiful. It means legacy is like flying. Somebody always follows the path. She smiled. You should write that down. I did, he said proudly, holding up a sticky note scrawled with messy letters. She kissed the top of his head. That night, after he went to bed, Nadine sat alone at her desk. She opened a blank notebook. At the top of the page, she wrote a title, the line in the contract. Not the legal one, the real one, the one she'd made silently with herself. To speak without volume, to protect without spotlight, to change without permission. She didn't write much more, just one final sentence before closing the book. Let the systems speak better, now not in my voice, but in their own. She closed the cover. The city hummed outside. A plane passed overhead, lights blinking across the dark. And Nadine Carter, architect of quiet revolutions, folded her hands and exhaled, not because the story was over, but because the next one would not need her name to begin. Thank you for joining us on this journey through courage, dignity, and the quiet power of change. Dr. Nadine Carter's story reminds us that discrimination isn't always loud. It often hides behind polite questions and unexamined assumptions. But silence does not mean surrender. It can be the force that reshapes systems and demands accountability. Let's carry this lesson forward. Respect is not a favor to be granted, but a right to be honored. Every one of us has the power to break cycles of bias, starting with how we see each other in everyday moments. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more voices and stories that matter, sparking change one conversation at a time. Stay with us because the fight for justice is ongoing, and the next story might just change the way you see the world.